important peripheral nerve injuries. Uh, so we'll start the lecture. So by nerve injuries, we are basically dealing here with the peripheral nerve injuries. So uh, the nerves which come out of the spinal cord, they are called as spinal nerves, and there are a total of 31 spinal nerves. These spinal nerves then later on they go ahead to form the plexus. Two important plexi are the brachial plexus for the upper limbs and lumbar plexus for the lower limb, lumbosacral plexus. And from these plexuses, the branches which come out are the peripheral nerve. So what we'll be dealing here in this talk will be basically the important peripheral nerve injuries, their concepts of diagnosis and management. So out of all the peripheral nerves, the most commonly injured peripheral nerve is the radial nerve in the upper limb. There are two important classification systems for nerve injuries, namely the Seddon classification and the Sunderland classification. So we'll just briefly touch the classification system, the important one, which is the Seddon classification. So understand the Seddon classification, uh, we first of all need to know what is Tinel sign. Now, Tinel sign is a clinical sign which is elicited for the evaluation of a peripheral nerve injury. In the Tinel sign, the examiner taps along the course of the peripheral nerve, the distal course of the peripheral nerve, starting from the distal most end. For example, if you have a radial nerve injury which has occurred in the arm because of shaft or fibrous fracture, or for example, the median nerve injury which has occurred around the elbow, the examiner starts tapping along the median nerve course from the hand and wrist, and slowly he moves proximally, and he asks the patient to tell or point out the point where, on tapping along the course of the nerve, the patient feels an electric sensation, uh, like tingling sensation in the distal most distribution of the nerve. Okay, so there may come a point where, on tapping on the nerve, there may be a tingling on paresthesia or electric current like situation at the level of tapping. That is not the Tinel sign. This the point where the electric current like sensation is perceived in the distal most distribution or the course of the nerve is the location where we label the Tinel sign to be positive. And this location is marked in reference to any nearby bony relationship, and this distance is measured, and the patient is called for serial follow-up after say 4 weeks or 1 month interval, and it is seen whether the Tinel sign has progressed distally or it has become static at that point. Now, with certain classification, we have three important classification of nerve injuries. The first one is the neuropraxia. What is neuropraxia? In neuropraxia, there is no anatomical distribution or a damage to the nerve, but because of pressure, the nerve conduction stops or is blocked physiologically. Okay, so there is no damage to any of the peripheral nerve coverings or the fibers, but because of pressure, the nerve conduction stops. Important examples are Saturday night palsy, crutch palsy, or tourniquet palsy. The good thing about neuropraxia is that it has a very good prognosis, and recovery by and large occur within 6 weeks. Usually it takes 3 to 6 weeks in a neuropraxia kind of lesion for the nerve recovery to occur. And important clinical features are that the Tinel sign is not there, and there is no motor march. The second kind of nerve injury in this classification is axonotmesis. As the name suggests, uh, it is the discontinuity of the axons. Okay. Now, because these kind of injuries they generally occur because of traction to the nerve, which can occur because of any nearby joint getting dislocated, or any bone getting fractured to which the nerve is closely associated. For example, a shaft humerus fracture can get fractured, and the radial nerve, which is very closely associated to it, can get stretched, and that can cause an axonotmesis type of lesion. Okay, so there is axonal interruption, but the outermost covering, the myelin sheath, is very much in continuity. Sorry, the endoneural tubes are intact. There is axonal and myelin disruption, and the recovery occurs by a by a process where the axons and the myelin sheath are gradually regenerated from the point of injury. Okay, so because the endoneural tubes are intact, the recovery is possible on its own, but the recovery will take some time because the axons and myelin sheath have become damaged. So they start recovering from the site of injury, and this recovery usually takes about 1 millimeter per day. So this recovery generally takes time. So the important clinical features are that if you examine this patient on serial X-rays, for example, if you give 2 to 3 weeks for Wallerian degeneration, then the recovery will start. So if you examine the patient 1 month after the injury, you will see that some tinal sign has started coming positive. Okay, so that will be a good sign. And if you call this patient again after 1 month, then you expect this tinal sign to move that it would have moved distally. The amount of recovery generally is 1 millimeter per day. So that amounts to 30 millimeters in 30 days, which is roughly an inch. So if on serial examination or follow-up examination, you find that the sternal sign has moved around 1 inch distally in 1 month, that means it is a satisfactory recovery, and the nerve is recovering and it will recover. The second clinical sign is seen is called as motor march. Now, what is motor march? Motor march seen that after a nerve injury, when the recovery occurs, then the recovery follows a certain pattern, which is in the innervation of the muscles of from that nerve. For example, the proximal most innervated muscles will recover first, and subsequently the distal muscles. For example, in case of radial nerve paralysis, the recovery which will occur, it will in a motor march kind of a pattern, it will slowly re-innervate triceps, then it will re-innervate the extensors around the elbow, which is small extensors like and coneus. Then it will re-innervate supinator, and then it will go to extensors of the wrist, namely the extensor carpi radialis brevis and longus, and then it will move to extensors of the fingers and the thumb. Okay. The third kind of lesion is called as neurotemesis. As the name suggests, neurotemesis means the complete anatomical disruption of the nerve. Now, that usually occurs when there is a extensive crushing injury, avulsion injury, or or a sharp cut injury to the nerve. For example, a gunshot wound to the arm, stab injury to the arm. The knife or the gun shot goes inside the arm and it completely cuts or damages the radial nerve. So in this kind of scenario, you can expect that the any nerve will get completely anatomically disrupted and dissociated, and the all the layers of the nerve are completely torn and separated, and therefore the spontaneous recovery cannot occur. Okay, so this in this kind of lesion, neurotemesis, the spontaneous recovery will never occur unless you do something surgically to repair the nerve, and therefore there is no tinal sign seen, and tinal sign is not seen, and there is no progression of the tinal sign as well. Okay. Now, what are the various prognostic factors upon which the nerve recovery depends? The nerve recovery depends, first of all, what is the kind of lesion. So, as we discussed, neuropraxia has a very good prognosis because all the layers are intact and it's just a physiological block. So recovery will occur spontaneously. Axonotemesis is the second best prognosis because some layers in the endoneural tubes are intact, and therefore the myelin and the axonal degeneration will occur. While neurotemesis has a worse prognosis because all the layers of the nerve are in discontinuity, and unless and until surgical repair is done, the recovery does not occur. Then it depends on the level of lesion. Distal lesions have better prognosis than proximal lesions because in proximal lesions, the motor march or the recovery has to reach from a site of injury which is far from the distal most innervated muscle. So in distal lesions, the distance for the recovery and the last muscle to be innervated is very small. So the recovery is better. Then depends on the type of nerve. Pure motor and sensory nerves do better than mixed nerve. Children have better prognosis and recovery rates as compared to adults, and the gap. If the gap is more than 2.5 centimeters, then the results of repair are poor. Okay? And time for the repair to be done. The more the delay in the surgical repair of the nerve, the poorer is the prognosis because as time passes by, the motor end plates for the innervated muscles, they get degenerated, and by the time recovery reaches there, they might not recover, or they might not, the muscle function may not be restored. Okay, so the more the delay in recovery or repair of a nerve, the poorer is the prognosis. Now, what are the various treatment options, or namely the surgical treatment options uh, for repairing a nerve? So, what we can do is neurolysis. Neurolysis means that you can explore the nerve and remove all the additions uh, in a nerve which has been completely surrounded by fibrosis. Then you can do a neurography. Neurography means repair of the nerve. It can be partial neurography or a complete neurography. In partial neurography, the nerve is partially cut and you do the partial repair. While in complete neurography, there is complete disruption of the nerve and you freshen the ends and join the whole circumference of the nerve end to end. Many times, because of delay, number one, and maybe because of extensive damage to the nerve, we may not be able to approximate the cut ends in the nerve to each other. In that case, we might have to do something called as nerve grafting. Now, nerve grafting is a procedure in which a nerve is taken, a sacrificable or a dispensable nerve is taken from some other side, and it is used to interpose the cut ends of the injured nerve. The most commonly used nerve for nerve grafting is sural nerve, which is taken from the leg, because it supplies only a very small strip of sensory innervation around the lateral border of the foot, and it is used to graft any other injured nerve in the body. Then another procedure which can be done is the nerve transfers. In nerve transfers, a healthy innervated nerve to some other muscle is taken, and the innervation is reinserted into the paralyzed muscle. Okay, for example, um, um, in traumatic brachial plexus injuries, spinal accessory nerve to uh, can be used to reinnervate the suprascapular nerve, or intercostal nerves. There are many intercostal nerves. So one of the intercostal nerve can be used, and its innervation reinserted into the musculocutaneous nerve of the upper limb. Musculocutaneous nerve, as we will see later, it supplies some important muscles around the elbow joint, and it can help restore lost elbow flexion. And lastly, what we can do is tendon transfers. So tendon transfers are the procedures which can be done when the nerve recovery does not occur or fails to recover, or some in a scenario where too much delay has occurred because of nerve injury and the nerve recovery cannot occur. Okay, so if the repair has failed, if the recovery is not occurring after a successful repair, or if the patient is presenting very late, then tendon transfer can be done. Now, what is the tendon transfer procedure? In tendon transfer, the tendon of a healthy muscle is used and reinserted into the tendon of a paralyzed muscle to restore its function. For example, a very commonly done tendon transfer is pronator teres to extensor carpi radialis brevis and longus. Pronator teres is supplied by median nerve. ECRB, ECRL are supplied by radial nerve. And ECRB, ECRL, they are responsible for dorsiflexion of wrist joint. In radial nerve paralysis, when the recovery of wrist extension is not occurring, pronator teres can be released from its insertion on the radius muscle, and its insertion can then be sutured to the ECRL ECRB muscle, so that whenever the median nerve innervation goes into pronator teres for contraction, it in turn leads to contraction of the ECRB ECRL, and therefore wrist dorsiflexion can occur. Coming to some common nerve injuries which we will discuss. The first is the musculocutaneous nerve. Now, musculocutaneous nerve uh, is a branch of the lateral cord of the brachial plexus, and it supplies three important muscles: the biceps brachii, brachialis, and coracobrachialis. Okay. Now, biceps brachii, brachialis, and coracobrachialis, they're all very important flexors of the elbow joint. Okay, and after supplying these three muscles, the musculocutaneous nerve supplies the skin on the lateral side of the forearm as by continuing as lateral cutaneous nerve of the forearm. Okay, so you may get a scenario in which you'll be told that a patient with dislocation of the shoulder presents with weakness of elbow flexion and sensory loss along the lateral aspect of forearm. So if this scenario is there, the most likely nerve injury is the musculocutaneous nerve. Okay. So very common injury which can cause musculocutaneous nerve injury is the anterior dislocation of the shoulder joint. Okay. The next is the axillary nerve injury. Axillary nerve injury is a branch from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus, and it turns around the surgical neck of the humerus and supplies two important muscles, the deltoid muscle and the teres minor, and supply the skin overlying the insertion of the deltoid. And fractures of the proximal humerus, dislocation of the shoulder, they can cause an axillary nerve injury, and the patient will present with loss of abduction from 15 to 90 degrees. The patient will not be able to abduct the shoulder from between 15 to 90 degrees. Okay, remember the first 15 degrees of abduction around the shoulder is caused by supra spinatus muscle, which is not supplied by the axillary nerve. So patient will be able to do first 15 degrees of abduction, but he will not be able to do abduction uh, between 15 to 90 degrees. And there will be a sensory loss over the insertion of the lower half of deltoid. Okay, this area is the area where the army people in regiments, they wear a badge on the arm, and therefore this sign, the loss of sensation in this area, is called as regimental badge sign. The important thing to note here is that there is no sensory loss over the tip of the shoulder. The tip of the shoulder is supplied by some other nerves, and therefore the correct answer that where the sensory loss would be there is the skin over the lower half of the deltoid. Another common mechanism of injury of axillary nerve is post-injection paralysis. Sometimes the intramuscular injection in deltoid can be given wrong site, which can damage the axillary nerve, and that can lead to axillary nerve paralysis. Coming to the next important peripheral nerve injury of the upper limb, the radial nerve injury. Radial nerve is a branch of the posterior cord of the brachial plexus, and it gives various branches in the upper limb. Importantly, it supplies the first of all supplies the triceps muscle when it is uh, in the spiral groove and just above the spiral groove as well. Spiral groove is a groove along the posterior aspect of the humerus. After passing through the spiral groove and around when it is about to reach the elbow, it supplies branches to the brachialis muscle, the brachioradialis muscle, and extensor carpi radialis longus. After crossing the elbow joint, it gives a divides into two branches, a deep branch and a superficial branch. Deep branch is called as PIN, posterior interosseous nerve, which supplies all the finger and thumb extensors. It also supplies the supinator muscle. It supplies the extensor carpi radialis brevis as well. And a superficial branch, which is the sensory branch of the radial nerve, which goes and supplies the skin over the dorsum of the hand, the first web space, dorsum of the hand. Okay. The autonomous zone of the radial nerve is the dorsum of the first web space. Now, this term is often used in context with the nerve injuries. Autonomous zone. What is autonomous zone? Autonomous zone is an area of skin which is supplied exclusively by that nerve. Normally, in any area of the skin in our body, there are two or three nerves which are overlapping uh, from the point of view of innervation. But there is one area along the course of the nerve which is supplied only by that nerve and not by any other nerve. So that area is called as autonomous zone, and it is the autonomous zone that we have to check for confirming the sensory loss in a nerve's distribution. Okay. Now, what are the various types of radial nerve injury? Radial nerve gives many branches along its course, and depending upon where the injury is occurring and which group of muscles are getting paralyzed, you can have four types of or three types of radial nerve injuries. First of all, you can have a very high radial nerve palsy, which example occurs uh, in Saturday night palsy or crutch palsy. Okay, the injury is high up in the axilla or in the upper arm, where all the muscles supplied by the radial nerve will be paralyzed. So the patient will present to you with a wrist drop, with weakness of the hand extensors, finger extensors, thumb extensors. In addition to that, the triceps will also be paralyzed. Okay, so it is a neuropraxia kind of lesion which can occur because of, for example, because of digging of crutches inside the axilla. And since it is a neuropraxia, it has a very good prognosis. The next type of radial nerve injury is the high radial nerve palsy, and high radial nerve palsy typically occurs when the radial nerve gets injured in the radial groove. In the radial groove, the muscles, namely the triceps and the anconeus, they have already received its innervation before the injury occurs in the spinal groove, and therefore triceps will be spared. But the patient will present with a wrist drop and sensory loss over the anatomical snuff box. Okay, this injury typically occurs when radial nerve gets injured with a shaft humerus fracture. Patient presents you with wrist drop, but the triceps is spared. Okay, so this is uh, called as a high radial nerve type of palsy. Then you have the low radial nerve palsy. Low radial nerve palsy occurs with injury of the radial nerve around the elbow. In this kind of nerve injury, the brachioradialis, ECRL, ECRB are spared. Okay, so the patient will have preserved elbow extension. Patient will have a preserved wrist extension as well. So there will be no wrist drop in this kind of palsy, but the extensors of the hand joints, the metacarpophalangeal joints of the hand, the extensors of the thumb joints, they will be paralyzed. So patient will have inability to extend the finger joints. Patient will have inability to extend the thumb, interphalangeal joint of the thumb, but his wrist extension will be preserved. And in addition to that, there will be sensory loss. Okay, the last kind of nerve injury is a PIN lesion or a posterior interosseous nerve injury, which can occur because of injuries of the or fractures of the radial head around which the PIN is closely associated, or any surgery around the proximal radius. And in this pattern, the elbow wrist extension are again spared, but there is no sensory loss because PIN is a pure motor nerve. And paralysis is similar to that of a low radial nerve injury, namely, there is a thumb drop and there is a finger drop. So there is no wrist drop, the elbow extension is spared, but the thumb extensors are paralyzed, the finger extensors are paralyzed. Okay, so you can clinically classify radial nerve in these patterns. Okay, now radial nerve, out of all nerves in the peripheral nerves in the body, it has the best prognosis after the injury. Why is that so? There are two important reasons. One, radial nerve is a dominantly motor nerve. It has a very small component of sensory uh, innervation, so it's a dominantly motor nerve. So it largely contains only one kind of motor fibers. So after the injury, the recovery, the similar fibers recovery is better and faster. But if a nerve is a mixed nerve, which has a high component of both mixed and motor and the sensory innervations, in that case, the recovery is usually delayed. Okay, so a predominantly motor nerve or a sensory nerve or a pure motor nerve has a better prognosis. Number two, the radial nerve injury most commonly occurs because of a shaft humerus fracture. And between the site of injury, namely in the mid shaft, say, and the first innervated muscle, namely the triceps muscle, all the innervations of the radial nerve are around the elbow. It does not supply any muscle beyond the mid forearm. All the innervations, they occur around the elbow joint. So the distance between the site of injury and the innervations is very small, and therefore the recovery is fast. If you consider the example of say ulnar nerve in an arm, an ulnar nerve injury around the elbow or in the arm takes will take a long time to recover because the ulnar nerve has to go and supply muscles in the hand also, namely the umbilicals and the interossei and the hypothenar muscles. So that will take some time. Okay. The splint which is used for radial nerve is called as a Cockop splint, and one of the tendon transfers which is often done for a unrecovered radial nerve is called as a modified Jones procedure. Coming to the ulnar nerve again it arises from the brachial plexus, from the medial cord of the brachial plexus, and it enters the upper limb. It hardly gives any branches in the arm, and it crosses the elbow joint. And after crossing the elbow joint, it gives two important branches in the forearm, namely to the flexor carpi alaris and the medial half of the flexor digitorum profundus. And then it crosses the wrist joint on the ulnar side and goes into the hand, where it supplies all the hypothenar muscles. Uh, and after the hypothenar muscles, it supplies the third and the fourth lumbricals. There are four lumbricals in the hand. It supplies all the interossei. There are two sets of interossei, the palmar interossei and the dorsal interossei, and it goes on to supply one of the thenar muscle, one important thenar muscle, which is the adductor pollicis. Okay, so this anatomy you will have to go home and revise again after this class, so that you are able to get a better grasp on what are the clinical features of these nerve injuries. Now, ulnar nerve injury has has a not very good prognosis because it's a highly mixed nerve and it is involved in the finer movements of the hand. So by the time the nerve recovery reaches the hand, the muscles have undergone some degeneration and the recovery does not lead to a very good outcome. Okay, the most common site of ulnar nerve injury is in the distal forearm and the wrist, and the autonomous zone of the ulnar nerve is the middle and the distal phalanges of the little finger. Okay. Now, ulnar nerve injury can have two patterns. It can be high ulnar nerve injury and a low ulnar nerve injury. Now, what is the difference? In high ulnar nerve injury, the muscles innervated in the forearm are also paralyzed, namely the FCU and the FDP. Okay, it typically occurs because of an injury near the elbow, and FCU, FDP are also paralyzed along with the muscles in the hand. And the typical sign of ulnar nerve injury, the claw hand, is less prominent. This phenomenon is called as ulnar paradox. What is ulnar paradox? Ulnar paradox is that in a high ulnar nerve palsy, clawing becomes less prominent. Okay, why is that so? If you look at the picture which has been shown, the clawing typically occurs because of two important components: paralysis of the lumbricals, which leads to hyperextension of the MCP joint, and flexion of the interphalangeal joint, which is because of the FDP. If FDP is paralyzed, one component, which is the flexion of the interphalangeal joint, will not be that prominent, and therefore the clawing is less prominent. In low ulnar palsy, FCU-FDP is spared, but all the other branches in the hand are paralyzed. Therefore, the lumbricals are not acting, the hyperextension occurs in the MTP joints, and the FDP is acting. So FDP leads to a prominent flexion of the interphalangeal joint, and therefore the clawing becomes more prominent. Now, what are the clinical signs of ulnar nerve injury? We'll discuss these signs quickly one by one. The first is the claw hand. Now, clawing is the most characteristic feature of the ulnar nerve injury, and the clawing is a partial claw hand, which is the clawing of the third and of the little and the ring finger. And the clawing occurs because of the paralysis of the lumbricals muscles. The lumbrical muscles, as shown in the picture, is responsible for this position, which is the pen holding position, namely flexion at the MCP joint and extension of the IP joint. So when there is a clawing, a reversal of these actions occur, namely the extension at the MCP joint and flexion of the IP joint, which is a claw hand. The next clinical sign is the Froment sign. In Froment sign, you ask the patient to hold a book or a piece of paper between his thumb and the index finger, and when pinching it, normally a patient would use his strong thenar muscle, which is the adductor pollicis, to grasp the book or the paper. When the adductor pollicis is paralyzed, which is supplied by the ulnar nerve, the patient uses the flexor of the thumb, the FPL, which is supplied by the median nerve, to grasp the book or the thumb. This sign is called the Froment sign. Then we have two tests for the interossei, the card test and the Igawa's test. We have two set of interossei, palmar interossei and dorsal interossei. If you remember your anatomy, palmar interossei are adductors, PAD, PAD, and dorsal interossei are abductors, DAB. Okay, so for palmar interossei, you do the card test. You insert a card between the fingers and ask the patient to hold it. Normal patient with strong palmar interossei would be able to hold the card, but a patient with ulnar nerve paralysis and weak palmar interossei will not be able to hold it, and the examiner will be able to easily pull out the card. Okay, and Igawa's test is for dorsal interossei, where you're checking the fingers abduction. Coming to the next nerve, the median nerve. The median nerve is also an important branch, peripheral nerve of the upper lip, and the median nerve again hardly gives any branches in the axilla and the upper arm, and it reaches around the elbow joint. And on crossing the elbow joint, it supplies lots and lots of muscles. Okay, it supplies almost all the muscles in the forearm. In the forearm, there are two sets of muscles: the superficial and the deep. Okay, in the superficial group there are 5 muscles, in the deep group there are 3 muscles, and the median nerve supplies all of them except 1.5. Which are the 1.5? the ones which were supplied by the ulnar nerve, namely the FCU and one half of the flexor digitorum profundus, FDP. Rest all of them are supplied by the median nerve, and then the median nerve goes through the wrist joint, and it goes through a space called as carpal tunnel, and it reaches into the hand. In the hand, it goes on the thenar side and supplies all the thenar muscles except one important thenar muscle which was supplied by the ulnar nerve, which is the adductor pollicis. That is not supplied by median nerve; it is supplied by the ulnar nerve. Okay, and it goes further and supplies the lateral two lumbricals, the first two lumbricals. Okay, then it stops there. The ulnar two lumbricals are supplied by the ulnar nerve. The hypothenar all are supplied by the ulnar nerve. Okay, so coming to this, with the knowledge of this anatomy, we go on to discuss the features of median nerve injury. The median nerve is most commonly injured near the wrist. Very common example is a glass cut injury around the wrist or fractures around the distal radius. It can also get involved in compression neuropathies, the more commonest compression neuropathy being carpal tunnel syndrome. From sensory standpoint, they are more disabling than injuries of ulnar nerve because sensations to three important digits, the thumb and the index and the middle finger, which are used to perceive sensations of most of the daily activities, they are lost in median nerve injury. So they are very disabling injuries from sensory point of view. The autonomous zone for the median nerve is a tip of the index and the middle finger. Okay. Now, what are the clinical signs? Let's discuss the signs one by one. The first is the pen test. Now, pen test is for a thenar muscle abductor pollicis brevis. In this, you ask the patient to touch a pen which has been kept in 90-degree plane to the palm, and the patient abducts the thumb 90 degrees to the plane of the palm to touch the pen. A normal patient is able to do that. A patient with paralyzed abductor pollicis brevis because of median nerve injury is not able to touch the pen in this position. Okay. The second is the ape thumb deformity or simian hand. Okay, you can see a normal hand is a prominent thenar muscle, thenar bulk, but in a median nerve paralyzed patient, there is complete thenar atrophy. The thumb lies adducted to the rest of the hand. Okay, this is called as an ape thumb deformity or a simian hand. Okay, the other important tests are pointing index sign. What is pointing index sign? Pointing index sign is that you ask the patient to make a fist. You ask the patient to make a fist, and on asking the patient to make a fist, this point index finger goes on standing out. The patient is not able to flex the index finger because the flexor digitorum profundus of this is paralyzed. Okay, remember the FDP of this is supplied by the median nerve. These two are supplied by the ulnar nerve. So when you ask the patient to make the fist, he is not able to flex the index finger, and the index finger keeps standing on. This is called as the pointing index sign. Okay, now there are some variants of this test. One commonly used variant is used in children. Now children have a great capability of making trick movements. So when you ask a child to do a test like this, he knows that you are trying to looking for pointing index. So what he will do is he will use this finger, the middle finger, and instead of showing you this, he will do the trick movement to use middle finger to flex this wire trick maneuver. Okay, so to prevent the child from doing this, you ask the child to make a clasp like this, and in this position he will not be able to do the trick movement, and in case of pointing index, the index finger will not be able to flex because of the trick movement as well. This is called as the Ochsner clasp test. Okay, the third is a benediction sign. You can see in the picture that benediction sign is that you ask a patient to make a fist, and these two fingers get flexed and these two keep standing out because of the paralysis of the FDPs. And this attitude is often associated with the Pope benediction hand, so it is called as the benediction sign. Okay. Now, few points about the general management of the nerve injuries. How do you manage them? Okay. Now, it depends on what kind of injury you are dealing with. First of all, if it's an open injury, means you have a patient with a gunshot injury or a stab injury or an open fracture who has come to you and he has a nerve palsy, then most likely you are dealing with a neurotemesis. The principle is to explore immediately or early and look at what is the condition of the nerve. And if it is if it is in a repairable condition, you repair it then and there, a primary repair. Okay. What if you have a closed injury? For example, a shaft humerus fracture uh, patient comes to you who doesn't have an open wound and you examine him and you find there is a radial nerve palsy. Okay, what to do in such cases? In such cases, the injury is usually a neuropraxia or axonotmesis, usually. And the principle is to wait and watch. Okay, if it is neuropraxia, it will recover spontaneously in 3 to 6 weeks. Now we wait and watch, and we get an electromyogram or electrodiagnostic studies at 3 to 4 weeks. At 3 to 4 weeks, if the EMG is showing some recovering potentials, some recovering waves, defibrillation potentials are seen, then you wait. If you do not see any recovering potential at 4 weeks, again repeat the EMG at 6 to 7 weeks. If it is not showing any recovery at that point also, then you might be looking at a case where it is possibly a neurotemesis or cut nerve in a closed injury as well. Then you might have to explore early. Okay. Now looking at the scenario where recovering potentials are seen in the EMG at 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, that's a good sign. Then you again examine the patient after another 3 weeks or 6 weeks, and you start looking for Tinel sign. If the Tinel sign appears, that means it's a good sign, some recovery is occurring. Okay, and again call the patient after every 3 to 4 weeks to see if the Tinel sign is progressing distally or not. If the Tinel sign is progressing distally with subsequent examinations, that means the recovery is moving forwards, and it's a good scenario, the recovery will occur on its own. By this time, if it was a neuropraxia, it would have recovered completely on its own. If it is an axonotmesis, the Tinel sign will keep on progressing forwards, and you can keep examining the patient. Meanwhile, you can give a brace to the patient, the braces that we have discussed, and wait for the recovery to occur on its own. Okay, there may be a scenario in which the recovery stops midway. The Tinel sign stops progressing after few visits. It stops progressing forwards. Or there may be a scenario where the EMG does not show any recovering potentials after 6 weeks as well. In that cases, you will have to go inside, you will have to surgically explore the patient, look at the status of nerve. If the ends can be brought together, do a repair or a neurography. If the ends cannot be brought together, use a sural nerve graft and do a nerve grafting. Okay. What about the cases which present to you late? There may be some patients who can present to you after many weeks of injury, delayed presentation. In that cases, uh, you can opt for an option of nerve exploration and repair depending upon how much time has passed. If many months or years have passed, then there is no point in exploring the nerve, because even if you surgically repair the nerve, no recovery will reach the distal most muscles, and the muscles would have muscle end plates would have degenerated. So it is better to do a tendon transfer for such patients. Take a healthy muscle which can be used from some other nerve and insert it into the paralyzed muscle. Okay. The tendon transfer can also be done after you have done the repair and the recovery is not occurring. Sometimes even after surgical repair, this recovery is poor or not satisfactory, and tendon transfer remains the only option after that. Okay, so these are basic principles based on which we do the management of the nerve injuries. Okay, now it will be very good for you that after this class you go home and read about the anatomy and the innervations of all these muscles, because all the clinical signs of these muscles, even in theory and when you come to the clinics and to see the patients with such injuries, it all depends on the anatomy of the understanding of the nerves and their muscle innervations. Okay, so it would help you that you go and read the innervations of these muscles, revise your anatomy as well. Okay, so we finish this talk here. So if we have any questions, we can take another 1 or 2 minutes and then we can wrap up. You can write in the chat box. Okay, then we'll call it a day. Thank you so much